This week on MotoMan, new cars, classic cars, and a business lesson from the ultimate car guy. Most of Wall Street and every proper car guy know about GM's stunning turnaround when Bob Lutz walked back in the door in 2001. Sadly, Bob retired in 2010, and not exactly being the ideal candidate for a Florida Golf membership, Bob decided to tell the story behind the story that brought us cars like these. Bob!
Hey, MotoMan.
All right, you're getting it ready for me.
Just cleaning things up a little bit.
Well, thank you. You got the LaSalle out today?
Yes. I thought it would take advantage of the break in the weather and clean it up from the last drive. It had, some summer bugs stuck to it.
Look at this. Look at the beautiful details on this.
Yeah, this was one of Bill Mitchell's early works when he joined General Motors. From a design standpoint, this was years ahead of its time.
I love the Art Deco details on it.
Yeah, it abounds. You see these little elements, these chevrons, and then of course the biplane bumper showing the fascination with aviation at the time. And then of course look at the hood ornament with the three sort of Art Deco black things. So it's the more you look at this car, the more you discover. First of all, the overall shape is great.
Yeah.
But the more you go into the detail, the more you see what a perfect design this is.
Bob, I read the book.
Well, I'm glad. How'd you like it?
I liked it a lot. It was a little different than I expected. I expected stories of General Motors. I expected all of your history, both first time and second time. But what I got was really a commentary on American business management and kind of a reason where our economy is today.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That really was kind of the theme of the book. And when I talked to the publisher the first time, he also thought it was going to be the story of how I turned GM product development. And he was kind of, yeah. But then I said it's also a commentary on where it all went wrong, not only in the American automobile industry, but in American industry in general.
I have to say it was really timely. You couldn't have asked for a better backdrop for your book to come out.
I agree with you because a lot of people, especially since the '08 subprime meltdown and all of the problems caused by Wall Street and caused by short-term analytical financial thinking, many more and more Americans are beginning to ask themselves, what's wrong with this picture? Why do we have these problems? Why do we import everything from China? Why don't we make anything anymore? And this book sort of helps answer some of those questions.
You answered a question which I didn't know about. Now, I'm a little bit younger than you, I'd say, just a little bit.
You could be my grandson.
Okay, this guy's very kind. You cataloged what happened, the change, really the catastrophic change both in government regulation as well as the car business in general.
Yeah, well, I really identified in the book the following factors. One is federal regulation. The corporate fuel economy standards, the original CAFE Act that was passed, I guess in the 70s, was a corporate fleet average, and it was devastating to the American car companies because we were the producers of the large V8 cars, body on frame, Pontiac GTOs, Chevy Impalas and everything. And the Japanese were all producing little four-cylinder cars, so they were on the good side of the average. They didn't have to change a thing. We had, all three Detroit companies had to keel haul keelhauled their whole product program. The V8s were gone, the rear-wheel drive was gone, and everything turned to the GM X cars, the Chrysler K cars. I mean, that's what the American industry had to produce in order to meet CAFE, and it was a monumental tear-up, and during that incredible short time window tear-up, frankly, we lost it on quality. That was one factor. The second one was the U.S. State Department, for geopolitical reasons, gave Japan a very advantageous yen, so that the Japanese producers for about the last 30 years, it's over now by the way, but for the last 30 years had a multi-$1,000 cost advantage over the American producers. And then I also blame management incompetence at all three companies. There was a wrong focus. There was a focus purely on financial results as opposed to producing great cars. The UAW has to take part of the blame because we had by far, on an hourly basis, by far the most expensive labor rates in the world.
So you don't think that the energy costs made a difference?
No, because we still have by far the cheapest fuel in the world in the United States.
Now, I know you have an interesting view on this for the U.S.
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, if I were emperor, I like to say if I were emperor of the United States and get things done, I would add a federal fuel tax of 25 cents a year, with just every year 25 cents more, until we get closer to the international average. Because Europe, they're paying between $7.50 and $8 a gallon, which is why they have a much more fuel-efficient fleet than we do, and that people are willing to pay like $35,000 for a Golf with a diesel engine. In the States, you're not going to get people to pay for the technology because even at $3.80 a gallon, it's still to the point where people quickly do the numbers. I'm paying this much for the technology, this much for fuel. I think I'll stay with a conventional engine. And if we're going to have to, and regulation is going to demand, they're talking about 62 miles per gallon by 2025. But to reach that, it's going to require the hybridization of a lot of cars, and people are going to be reluctant to pay for that technology unless fuel is more expensive. Quite aside from, in Europe, by the way, out of that $7 to $8 a gallon, $3.50 is taxes, which is why the Europeans have beautiful roads, beautiful bridges. Everything is always maintained, and you look at our country's road network, in most states, it's a shambles. There's no money to maintain it.
Let's step back a bit.
Yeah.
Now you just compared two systems.
Yeah.
And you make a compelling argument, but what would it do, consider where our economy is right now, if you were to raise the cost of energy?
Well, if I can answer that. If it's a sudden jump like it was in 08, 09, when it went from 220 to 450 overnight, that is devastating. That's like slamming on the emergency brake. But if it's predictable, a predictable 25 cents a year, everybody adjusts. And people, when they make their next car purchase, they sort of say, let's see, $350 this year, $375 next year, $4 the year after that. I think I'll go for the 4-cylinder engine, because now you're using the market mechanism to drive consumer behavior instead of using federal regulation, which results in extremely expensive cars, and then the government gives tax credits. Well, isn't that a stupid system? You sell the people cars they can't quite afford, and then you give them a tax credit. You could achieve the same thing through the market mechanism by gradually raising the price of pump fuel.
Bob, you talk a lot about government regulations, you talk about product, and you talk about the cost of energy. But what about management?
Well, that's a major theme of the book, and it's maybe the biggest factor of all was that in the post-war period, it started with Ford when they hired McNamara and the Whiz Kids. We got into an infatuation with the quantification of business, and the business schools picked that up, and they suddenly became legitimate at the universities because they were doing a lot of math like everybody else. And the whole thing became extremely sophisticated, and that gradually spread into senior management, and the passion for the product was lost. Everything became an exercise in numbers and returns and financial projections. And you know what? When you're dealing with a consumer products business where you have to trigger desire and love for the product, which I think Detroit is doing again.
Absolutely.
But there was a period where we just walked away from that, and the cars existed purely as a numerical exercise. You took money at the front end, put it into the car, it was transformed into a product, and then at the other end you got more money, and nobody really cared about what was in the middle. And that was the downfall of, really, I would say, the primal cause for the mediocrity of American cars for a long time.
So I'm a little bit confused here. You're talking about kind of a balance of power shift.
Yeah.
And really, whether it's Chrysler, Ford, GM,
Yeah.
the products were great, 50s, 60s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you're saying this new management
Yeah.
came in around
Management
the 60s.
philosophy, late 60s, early 70s.
The old adage is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. How did they get the balance of power to switch to this new management?
I think part of it was a reaction to the creative people being in charge, because this was the era in the 50s and 60s of Gene Bourdonnais at Ford, Bill Mitchell at GM. The designers were more famous than the CEOs were. They did these great flamboyant cars, you know, like Buick Rivieras and Cadillac Biarritzes with the huge tail fins and so forth. And some of the money was wasted because some of the vehicles were flops. And it just coincided with people becoming aware of, gee, these people are famous, but they're out of control, and we finance guys are just running around collecting the money. We've got to get this under control, and we have to start running this as a business. And so the creative people who drove the huge success in the 50s and 60s were sort of shunted aside, and the business guys, the numbers guys, had all the important positions in the company. And cars were kind of defined numerically. The package was defined, the shape was defined, all the interior dimensions were defined, and then it was handed to design and said, here, put a wrapper on this for us, would you please? That, I am happy to say, has changed radically, and I'm going to show you some examples of how good General Motors, and by the way the others also, have gotten at details of fit and finish and really beautiful design in the car that you just drove up in.
Well, let's check it out.
Yeah, okay. In the old days, we never would have done sharp corners like this or a sharp edge here. We were into what was called hiders. In other words, you rounded everything off. You rounded everything off here so that if parts were misaligned, you couldn't tell.
Okay, so those are detail-oriented changes. But what about design?
Well, it's what I call micro design, because design of an automobile exists on two levels. It exists on the level of what you see 30 or 40 feet away, and then it exists at the level of what you see 20 or 30 inches away. And they're both equally important. And I always said the Japanese weren't very good at macro design, but they were brilliant at micro design. And my thesis to GM was, we've got to be the world's best in both micro design, that is the individual little detail, and macro design. How does the car look from 30 or 40 feet away or on the road? And that we just upped our game, insisted on great designs. We're willing to make some compromises on upward visibility, maybe some compromise in rear seat elbow room and all of that stuff that the numbers guys would write down as extremely important. And we focused on how does the car look.
So what was harder to change? The detail stuff or the design?
They were getting the overall design and encouraging the people to create great shapes. It turned out to be easier because the designers know how to do that, and the only people you have to convince there are the designers. Whereas when it comes to all of the workmanship on the interior, the use of materials, etc., the designers got it, but then it went to the interior engineers and they said, oh, this can't be, we've never done that before, and they changed it all back to the old specification. Then we got that one fixed by talking to all the engineers. Then the engineers would do a really good job and release it to the suppliers, and the suppliers would look at it and say, what? GM wants that low gloss level? Oh, that must be some mistake. They've never asked for that before. We'll just do it the way they've always asked for it. So you really literally had to pursue it up the chain. And finally I got all the suppliers, all the trim suppliers in a big room. We had an all-day meeting, and we had what is known in the industry as a come to Jesus meeting. And
Come to Jesus in California.
yeah, yeah. Viene al Jesus. And I said, I pointed out the levels on German cars and on some of the better Japanese cars, and I said, this is what we want. We are no longer going to accept the old standard. And I was teaching the organization to be anal about detail, which is not the American way. You know, the American way is, hey, if it works, it's good enough. And getting people to focus on the beauty of detail was a tough task. But you know what? Once they got it, they became more anal than I was. And sometimes the guys would pick up stuff and say, oh, we got to change that. For instance, on the Buick LaCrosse, we had a gap here at the top of the A-pillar trim, as this one does a little bit too, and this is not a final car. But that gap, they actually delayed production to get rid of that gap that you could get your fingernail in.
Really?
And I thought to myself, I wonder how many people would actually complain about that. But the organization doesn't look at it that way anymore. If it's not perfect, they're not going to let it go.
So Bob, I know you, and you're a detail-oriented guy, but I was kind of surprised when I read the book that when you got there, it wasn't car guys that were coming up with the product ideas or coming up with the cars.
No, it was basically a very rote, mechanistic, and almost scientific product planning process, which was creating vehicles, but a lot of times they were the answers to questions nobody asked, or they were simply a version of something somebody else had already done.
Like the talking Buick?
Well, the talking Buick was a disaster. That was born out of another edict, top management edict, and the top management edict was, from now on, 40% of General Motors cars are going to be innovative. So the teams said, oh, gee, innovative, that's tough. We've never done that before. So people started doing crazy stuff in order to try to innovate. And one of them was the Buick Silent or Quiet Servant, which was this system with no instrument panel where you would talk to the car and the car would talk back to you. And you had to verbally scroll through menus. I mean, it was absolutely absurd.
Sounds maddening.
And with all my piloting experience, I could not properly make that car do what I wanted it to do. So I canceled that. And then the ill-fated Aztec was another manifestation of the management edict. 40% of all future vehicles must be innovative. So it became innovation for the sake of innovation. Whether it was any good or not didn't matter. Speaking of innovation, by a daring car company, I really got to show you something you're going to be interested in. It really exemplifies customer focus and innovation.
Let's check it out.
Here's a good example of what I'm talking about. This is a 1952 Citroën, but the design comes from 1934. They built it continuously for almost 19 years. A company that was run by product guys and engineers. It was the world's first unitized body, world's first large front-wheel drive, world's first four-wheel independent suspension, world's first car with an extremely modern proportion. And this car was Europe's #1 selling large car for almost 20 years. So the bet on technology and excellence really paid off for him.
Awesome, truly an awesome car. Now I gotta ask, you spent some time at GM both before and after all these changes.
Right.
And you came in and made a hell of a lot of changes. There must have been some resistance, some things going on.
Well, one of the things I noticed, and one of the things I like about this car is the way everything fits, you know, even after all these years. And frankly, in the 2001 to, the late 90s, General Motors cars had some really bad fits and finishes. And I complained about it, and we had a huge display of cars out at the Proving Ground. And we went around and I pointed out the beautiful body gaps on Japanese and German cars, and then we'd go over to ours. And finally, this huge guy by the name of Joe Spielman, who always came to work in Harley Davidson jackets. He's about 6'5" and weighs about 250 pounds. He grabbed me by the lapels and said, I've heard enough of this crap. just show me the one you like. And I took him over, I think it was a then model Hyundai Sonata, which had perfect fits. And he said, okay, this what you want? I said, yeah. And he says, you like these hood corners? I said, yep. He says, you like these door gaps? I said, yep. He says, you like the way the hood fits? I said, yep. And he says, okay, you're gonna get it. And by George, the next car we brought out had it. And from then on, I encourage people to compare the body fits and the assembly quality of a GM car to any import, regardless of price class, and I think we'll win the competition.
So it sounds like you had the knowledge already in the company, you just had to pull it out.
Well, the thing was, first we thought it was going to cost a lot for tooling, you know, new automatic hammers and a different way to do the presses and so forth. And we got, years later I asked Joe, I said, you know, we got this so fast, and I don't recall that we had to spend a lot of money to do it. And he said, that was an interesting thing. When I went to talk to the press shop supervisors and the guys in the body shop, they said, oh, we know how to do that. It's just nobody has ever asked us to do it before. Which just shows that there was a lack of attention to detail on the part of senior management.
So what's to keep it from happening again? Like, there was decision processes that were made that weren't great.
I think what happened is we had too much prosperity in the 50s and 60s. And there was too much of an internal Detroit focus, failure to recognize that international competition was doing better cars than we were. And I think that focus is here. The focus on greatness, on doing wonderful products, is here to stay. I know it is at GM, and Dan Ackerson and all of the senior leadership truly believe that the mission of General Motors is to design, build, and sell the world's best cars and trucks. And if you look at the newer Chrysler products like the new Jeep Grand Cherokee, you can tell they've got the focus on excellence. And of course, Ford has a lot of wonderful products out there too. And I think everybody realizes that the only thing that works is to be super competitive, benchmark the best, and then do a better car than that.
Bob, you've got a little bit of a historical car show going on around here. And if my memory serves me correctly, I know your dad had one of those LaSalles, like the one I saw.
34 LaSalle, yeah.
Yeah. Now what about this? Is this one that was in the family?
No, when it came to day-to-day cars, we usually had Chryslers and Fords, but I do have my dad's original, purchased by him, 1952 Aston Martin DB2, which is off in the other garage.
That I have to see.
Okay.
Bob, this is my speed.
Well, this is actually my dad's original 1952 Aston Martin DB2 Vantage with a 6-cylinder twin cam engine, and was kind of in desolate shape when I found it in Switzerland, and I had all the color and trim codes, and it's exactly back to where it was when he bought it. Custom handmade body. You notice there's no body joints anywhere. This whole front end of the car is one piece, so it's really a remarkable bit of coach building.
Oh, absolutely. Did you know, Bob, that I built a Morgan? I banged out my own tin on a Morgan.
Well, congratulations.
Yes, I know how hard that is.
Yeah, it is.
Bob, I'm a bit of an Aston Martin guy, but that's a company that's had a lot of ownership changes.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly, too.
Yes, sir. Now, in your book, you make a very interesting proposal for one of your crosstown rivals.
Yeah, 06, Chrysler was under the ownership of Cerberus, basically a financial company, and they weren't, they were having trouble with it. The size of the sales were shrinking and so forth. And Fritz Henderson and I took a look at it, and we decided, boy, putting the two companies together would save a lot of money. In fact, we identified $7 billion worth of synergies from putting the two companies together, and you could have, eliminated one finance group, one purchasing group, one legal group, consolidated manufacturing, and I think it would have been a marriage made in heaven. And we got Rick Wagner very interested in it. He took it to the board, and the board members, who are all very wise businessmen, but they only spend one day a month on the car business, said, well, doesn't Chrysler have UAW workers? And we said, yeah. And they said, well, why would we want to have even more UAW workers? And I said, well, yes, we all have UAW workers, but let's live with that, and let's get the company and acquire these $7 billion worth of synergies, which I am convinced if we had done that in '06 and Cerberus was willing, or early '07, that added profitability would have prevented the Chapter 11 of General Motors. And we obviously would have kept the brands. We would have kept Chrysler, Dodge, and the prize in the whole thing, of course, is the Jeep brand.
But how would you have differentiated the product? Because there are competing products.
Well,
in both
but
portfolios.
yeah, over time you could have consolidated architectures. For instance, you could imagine that a future rear-wheel drive Buick could have been off the same architecture as the Chrysler 300. And certainly you could have done architectural commonization in the pickup truck and SUV area because, for instance, there would have been no problem with future Ram pickups sharing the same chassis or same engines, same transmissions with the original GM ones. But you want to make sure that you put enough real difference into the vehicles that the customer doesn't get the feeling that they're just badge engineered. So you would have had to invest into the identity of the vehicles, which everybody has figured out, that you've got to have that. But spending that amount of money is trivial compared to keeping the separate product lines of the two companies going.
In GM, you kind of had the same decisions to make. You had Pontiac, you had Saab, you had Saturn, you had Hummer.
Yeah.
And personally would have preferred keeping around Pontiac.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Why was it that Pontiac left and GMC stayed when really a GMC and a Chevrolet pickup are very similar?
Yeah, but wait, if you look at the profitability of the brands, GMC is a highly profitable brand because it has a premium image, and if you look at the GMC Yukon, for instance, sell a lot of Denali's at very high margins. So when the government guys took a look at brand profitability, GMC was obviously a keeper. Pontiac, unfortunately, was in the process of renewal. I think we were just at the beginning of rebuilding Pontiac with cars like the G8, the Solstice Coupe, the regular Solstice. A future Pontiac was going to be a smaller rear-wheel drive sedan, sort of the size of a BMW 3 Series, but priced like a Pontiac. So I think Pontiac was eminently salvageable. But when you're in Chapter 11 and the government is writing the checks, the government guys said, look, we understand as well, we are not keeping Pontiac. And there was a kind of a choice between Pontiac and Buick. Buick was already in full recovery. Buick is doing phenomenally well in China. So Buick was obviously the keeper. Saab, Hummer, and Saturn had to go, and Pontiac.
Bob, you make a very interesting point about bringing manufacturing back into the U.S. I was in technology for many, many years of my life, and there was this whole idea of outsource,
Right.
but we had to redo the product 4 times with outsourcing
Right.
until we got it right.
Right.
And ultimately, we had to do the work
Right.
in this country.
Sure.
Now, what are some of the things that we could see or this country could do to make it cost competitive, product competitive, to do the manufacturing here?
Product competitive is a question of management mindset and what does management focus on as opposed to just the short-term bottom line. There's now absolutely no reason why we can't manufacture efficiently in the United States. For instance, even a union like the UAW has made major concessions to where they are now either competitive or very close to competitive with wage rates in other parts of the world. And then, more importantly, for years we had this extremely strong dollar with a relatively weak euro, a very weak yen, a very weak Korean currency. Well, partly thanks to our economic difficulties and partly also due to the deficit spending, we now have a very weak dollar. So the Japanese car companies and other Japanese product companies are complaining about the loss of profitability in the U.S. market because with a yen that's about 80 to the dollar, they are now facing the same problem that we faced for years. And the euro, of course, is super strong, which is going to be very difficult for European imports of all types. So right now, I think we've got a window of opportunity. We've got a great workforce, competitively priced. We have a lot of government regulation, but not that much more than anybody else. And we have a currency that is now in our favor.
So the $64,000 question, do you think today's American business managers, and I'm not talking just General Motors,
Yeah.
will do this, will make this decision?
I think the American businessmen, if we can get the business schools to, and by the way, several business schools have asked me to come and talk to them about this.
Even after the book?
Yeah, especially after the book.
They read the book?
Yeah, yeah. I actually told them about it. I said, you're not going to like the book because I criticize business schools for the absence of focus on the customer. And they said, boy, we'd like to have you come and talk to us about that. If we can change the focus of business from short-term profit maximization and this excessive focus on the shareholder and start focusing on producing great products and services, then I think we can train the next generation of managers to be much more effective than we were. And I know for a fact that the philosophy that I'm espousing is alive and well in the 3 American car companies.
Okay, so I guess we'll see like a Lutz wing at Harvard Business School?
Well, that would require a considerable transfer of my personal wealth to Harvard, which I don't think I'm ready to undertake.
I understand. Bob, I have to say you have great toys around here, but it's a really big place. How do you get around?
Hey, let me show you. Come on. And this is how we get around.
This is totally cool. We gotta try these things.
You know how to ride one?
I live in California with more of these than cars.
Okay.
Okay, Bob, it's a race to Priscilla.
All right.
Bob, when I first met you at the Heritage Center, I had no idea I'd be racing on a Segway a year later. Hi, Priscilla. I find it interesting that Bob Lutz learned about the car business in the early 60s from General Motors. But then 30 some odd years later, it was Bob Lutz that taught General Motors that it's all about laser focusing on the product. That not only applies to building great cars, that also applies to building great businesses.
And then I said, but it's also a commentary on what went wrong.
Sorry about that. She's on her mark, man. She doesn't move that swan. She's good.
But it's her pond.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and she's graciously allowing us to drive around it today.
Bob, you make a really interesting point about repatriating manufacturing.
This is going to be like the King's speech.
I know.
I'm going to start beating you about the head and shoulders and making you go la 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 la.
You want proof why Bob Lutz will never retire? So you'd think Mrs. Lutz is the boss of the house? You'd be wrong. Priscilla is.